Speaker Gingrich, thank you for being here tonight. Your plan for empowering local neighborhood boards to decide if certain illegal immigrants can stay in our country has been criticized on the ground that it could undermine the rule of law and encourage more illegal immigrants to come to our country. How do you respond to those claims?
Well, first of all, the Selective Service Board model that this was based on did not undermine the rule of law. It implemented the draft in World War II with great sensitivity, and it allowed local people, much like a jury trial, it allowed local citizens to render judgment about local people in what was seen as a very effective model. Second, I'm suggesting that this only apply to people who've been here a very long time, who have a real tie to the local community, and we're exploring the idea that they would actually have to have a family sponsoring them to be eligible for review. Now, to suggest that a model that only works after 20 or 25 years is going to be a magnet, I think is nonsense, particularly because in addition to controlling the border, which is part of my plan, we also have a provision for a guest worker program that would be legal and that would be implemented by American Express or Visa or MasterCard in terms of the cards, so you wouldn't have fraud, as you will in the federal government. And so if you're a brand new person looking to come to the U.S. for economic reasons, you'd have a legal point of entry, and there'd be no reason to believe anybody's going to be able to get across the border to stay here illegally for 20 or 25 years to someday around 2037 be eligible for review.
And of course the border is very, very important. But you spoke of jury trials, and as a former 20-year prosecutor, my concern is putting friends and neighbors in the position of judging their friends to determine if they can stay in this country.
That is what we do in a jury trial. That's the whole point. That's why the Founding Fathers, who distrusted judges, insisted on juries. Because ultimately, in a free society, the citizens have to bear responsibility for their own culture and their own society. And ultimately, I believe they are more trustworthy. If you ask me, would I trust a jury or a Washington bureaucrat? I would rather have my fate decided by a jury of my peers than have my fate decided by a Washington bureaucrat.
Mr. Speaker, you speak passionately about first principles and smaller government, yet you've supported individual mandates for health insurance, joined Nancy Pelosi with respect to climate change, advocated for a significant role for the federal government in education, and had close ties to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Why should limited government conservatives like me trust that a President Gingrich will not advance these sorts of big government approaches when you were president?
Well, first of all, the individual mandate originally was developed by Heritage Foundation and others as a method to block Hillary care in 1993, and virtually all of us who are conservatives came to the conclusion that, in fact, it was more dangerous and more difficult to implement and guaranteed that politics and politicians would define health care, and that's why virtually every conservative has, in fact, left that kind of a model. In terms of I've said publicly, sitting on the couch with Nancy Pelosi is the dumbest single thing I've done in the last few years. But if you notice, I never favored cap and trade. In fact, I actively testified against it. I was at the U.S. House Energy and Commerce Committee the same day Al Gore was there to testify for it. I testified against it, and through American Solutions, we actively fought it in the Senate, and I think we played a major role in defeating it. If you look at my total record, the only speaker in your lifetime to get to 4 balanced budgets, the developer of welfare reform, the biggest entitlement reform in your lifetime, somebody who has advocated a balanced budget constitutional amendment, somebody at Newt.org, I have a 21st century contract with America which calls for a very vigorous 10th Amendment enforcement.
Mr. Speaker, you have rattled off some conservative part of your record, but you also, as I rattled off, have a non-conservative part of your record. What will you do as a president to structure your administration to filter out what I would consider to be the non-conservative, non-limited government ideas that you produce, and to stick to a government that focuses on limiting the federal government, shrinking its power and its spending? How will you do that within your administration?
Well, first of all, in my active role in the Congress, I helped both with Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and I helped as Speaker of the House to shrink the federal government. We turned around the fiscal projections.
I'm asking as President, what are you going to do in your administration?
But I just want to start with the notion that I've actually done this before. So you have some reason to believe that I could get to a balanced budget because I've gotten to a balanced budget. You could have some reason to believe I could control spending because I've controlled spending before. We have, as part of our contract with America at Newt.org, a training program as part of appointing presidential appointees for the very reason you're suggesting. You cannot get the scale of change we want, and you can't get the scale of change the Tea Parties want, by just appointing good people who have no understanding of the fight they're about to be in and have no understanding of how difficult and hard Washington is. And I think we have to have a very clearly philosophically driven program that says this is where this administration is going. And by the way, not just the administration. You also have to apply pressure to the House and Senate, because under our Constitution, unless you have them moving with you, what you're going to get is very limited change.
Real quick. We're going to have to go. Okay. We've got to take a break, but we're going to continue with Speaker Gingrich after the break and give him all of his time. We will be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Huckabee and our special Republican Presidential Forum. We're going to continue with former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. The question comes from Scott Pruitt.
Mr. Speaker, good evening.
Good evening.
President Obama seems to think that Washington has all the answers to our national problems. But as you know, all national problems don't require national solutions. Can you name some national problems that neither the President nor Congress should solve?
Sure. I would say, first of all, education should be largely returned to the states, and most of the Washington bureaucracy should be dismantled, and states should be encouraged to adopt reforms themselves. I think Medicaid should be block granted back to the states, and states should be experimenting with what works best, because it's clear that the federal government has failed to manage that as a national thing. I want to develop an environmental solutions agency to replace the EPA with an agency which has to have economic rationality, has to look for innovation and entrepreneurship, and has to collaborate rather than dictate to state and local governments. So those would be three examples.
With regard to education, when you say largely returned to the states, what does that mean?
Well, I also think it ought to be returned to the citizens. I try to remind my friends who are in state government that the 10th Amendment actually talks about the states and the citizens. And it's not just moving power, for example, from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, or Washington, D.C. to Tallahassee, or Washington, D.C. to Oklahoma City. It's also moving power back. And I tell every group of citizens I talk to, if we shrink the Washington bureaucrats, we have to grow local citizenship. And so I would advocate states consider seriously a Pell Grant for K through 12. So that you actually, every parent has the right to choose where their grant goes, and you return power to the parents rather than to the government.
Mr. Speaker, you've proposed not just impeaching judges who issue rulings you deem unconstitutional, but you've also advocated abolishing entire federal appellate courts. If President Obama were to eliminate a judgeship where the judge ruled against the individual mandate in his signature health care law, would that be an appropriate application of your plan?
Well, first of all, the President couldn't do it. The President would have to have the support of the House and the Senate to do it. And if there's a judge, I've mentioned specifically Judge Barry in San Antonio, who issued a ruling on June 1st which said students not only could not pray at their graduation, they couldn't use the word benediction, they couldn't use the word invocation, they couldn't use the word God, they couldn't ask people to stand, they couldn't have a moment of silence. And he said in his order, if any of these are broken, I'm going to put the superintendent in jail. Now, as far as I'm concerned, he's essentially anti-American. And why would you allow
so
a
you
judge
want to
like
eliminate that court is your solution?
Yes, that's the Jeffersonian solution from the Judicial Reform Act of 1802.
Thank you.
But you can only do it if you have the House, the Senate, and the President.
Understood.
Okay.
Thank you.
Speaker, you've supported the Obama administration's use of Race to the Top to promote charter schools, and your campaign website calls for requiring states to adopt rigorous education standards. Now, we all agree that Race to the Top is a good thing, as well as charter schools. But is it wrong, yes or no, is it wrong for the federal government to intrude on the state's authority over education?
It's wrong. And that's why I said I would recommend we turn that power to the states. On the other hand, remember, presidents are both leaders of the American people and heads of a government. So a president can perfectly well go to a state and say, I urge you to adopt a Pell Grant program. I urge you to adopt charter schools. Nothing wrong with the president actually being a leader of the country, but that's different than saying, and the federal government will administer it, and the federal government will set the rules.
You can't have it both ways. Can't have it both ways.
No, I mean, you can say the government's not going to dictate, but that doesn't mean that a president can't, in fact, advocate change.
Mr. Speaker, I want to follow up a little bit on the appearance with Nancy Pelosi.
Yes.
And climate change. You've said, and you said earlier this evening, that was the dumbest thing that you've ever done.
Well, in recent years. I mean, I don't want to run my whole career through it.
Was it dumb because it was bad politics or dumb because it was bad policy?
Well, first of all, what I said there I think was accurate, which is you need innovation and you need to look at ways of positive ways of solving things. I was trying to make a case about a conservative environmentalism, which is the reason I'm for an Environmental Solutions Agency to replace the EPA. It was largely done because, frankly, she became so radioactive that it was impossible for any conservative to be in the same set and not have everybody go, that's crazy, and so they never heard your message. But I wrote a book with Terry Maple called Contract with the Earth, and it was an effort to argue that there were sound, pro-market science and technology innovations that would lead to a better environment, actually a more improved environment than you get out of lawyers and regulators and the EPA.
So we've got less than 30 seconds, so we're going to have to take a final question and a very quick one and a very quick answer.
All right, quick one. Who's your favorite founding father and why?
George Washington, because all of us stand on his shoulders, and in the absence, in fact, this is his command flag from Valley Forge. Without George Washington, there would have been no America. Without his dignity, his honor, his patriotism, and his endurance. He was in the field for 8 years, and as you know from your state, he returned to Mount Vernon for 1 week in 8 years. That's what he thought freedom was worth. That's the standard for us.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for your presence here tonight and for the time away from the campaign trail to answer these questions from the Attorneys General. Our next candidate is Speaker Newt Gingrich. Speaker Gingrich.
Mike, I want to thank you and the Attorneys General for what I think has been a very useful evening where people could look at the issues and see some very, very intelligent professional people asking some very good questions. This may be the most important election since 1860. 8 years of Barack Obama would be a disaster. And if he gets reelected with this economy, this deficit, these problems, he's going to think it vindicates his Saul Alinsky radicalism and his commitment to fundamentally change America. So we need your help because this is a big election. We have changes to make that are so big that no president could make them alone. So I'm not going to ask you to be for me, because if you're for me, you're going to vote, go home, and say, I sure hope Newt fixes it. I am going to ask you to be with me, because together we have to stand shoulder to shoulder to get the Congress to do the right thing. I look forward to working with you. And again, Mike, I want to thank you and the Attorneys General for what I think was a very, very useful evening.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich.